Right, hello again, year 8. So you're here for lesson 2 of the new scheme of work on the French Revolution. So last time we just did a short introduction looking at the idea of what a revolution was. So the idea of like a really dramatic, sudden change in how a society was run. Today we're going to be looking at, well, for the next couple of lessons, we're going to be looking at the causes of the French Revolution, okay? So what it was about how France was run before that meant that enough people thought it needed dramatic change to cause a revolution. Okay, so the title for today's lesson, I'd like you to write it down on a piece of lined paper or in your exercise book, depending on what you've got, which is how unequal was France before the revolution. Okay, so make sure you've got that written down first of all. Okay, so once you've got on that title, one key word for today, and I would like you to also copy this down as well as the title, which is the idea of privilege. Okay, so privilege is when someone has special rights or powers compared to other people. So you're probably quite used to the idea of people being called privileged. Yeah, so it's the idea about when someone has special rights or powers compared to someone else. It actually comes from the Latin for private law. Yeah, so the idea of like rules that only apply to certain people. Okay, so once you've got your title and your keyword, I would like you just to jot down as well, maybe like 3 bullet points. Can you think of any examples of privileges that teachers have compared to students? Okay, so I'll just give you a minute to do that. So pause the video here, make sure you've got the title, the keyword, and then 3 ideas for privileges that teachers have compared to students. Okay, year 8, so you should have done that now. So your title, keyword, and 3 ideas. So some examples you could have had of privileges for teachers. So remember, special rights that they have compared to students. So for example, you could say teachers can have the right to get their phone out in class without it being confiscated, although they obviously shouldn't. They can obviously walk down the up staircase, okay, when students have to follow the one-way system, and there are also certain rooms in the school that they can go into, like the staff room, which the students are banned from. Okay, so all those examples of privileges, okay, they are powers and rights that teachers have that students don't. Now, one thing we're going to see today is one of the big causes of France's revolution was there were huge gaps between the people at the top of society and those at the bottom, and it was felt that those at the top had way too much privilege. Okay, they had special powers and rights that most people didn't have, and that came to be seen as too unfair by most people. Okay, so before the French Revolution, France was a very unequal country. There were huge divisions between the rich and the poor. Many people began to resent the privileges. Remember, resent means like when you hate something, it kind of makes you annoyed and frustrated. So many people began to resent the privileges of certain groups in French society, particularly the aristocracy, who are the big landowners, and the clergy, the leaders of the church. Okay, so those privileges of those groups began to anger a lot of the French population. Now, another key word for today is the idea of a hierarchy. Okay, so before the revolution, there was a strong social hierarchy in France. People at the bottom had a lot more power and privilege than the majority of people at the bottom. Okay, so remember, a hierarchy is any system where the people at the top of the pyramid have more power than those at the bottom. Okay, so remember, it comes from the Greek words which are archy, which means ruled by, and higher is obviously the idea of like higher. So it's the idea that the people on top are the ones who rule. Okay, so if we think about a school hierarchy, for example, yeah, right, at the very top of the pyramid, you'd probably have the head teacher or the governors, yeah, who are at the top of the school hierarchy. You've then obviously got your SLT, okay, so your deputy heads, your assistant heads, etc. You've then got your ordinary teachers, okay, and then at the very bottom of the school hierarchy are you lovely students, okay, who are peasants in this analogy, okay? So a school is very much a hierarchy. Okay? There's a system where the people at the top have a lot more power and rights than those people at the bottom. And in the same way, France before the French Revolution was also a hierarchy, okay? At the very top of it, you had King Louis XVI, who was an absolute monarch, which meant he had complete power. He had very little restrictions on his power. Just below him, like the SLT, you had the clergy, okay, so the rulers of the church, who again had lots of rights and privileges we'll talk about in a minute. Just below the clergy and ruling with them with the king were the nobility or the aristocracy. So those are like the big fancy landowners, okay? And then you had the third estate, who are like you guys, the students. Everyone else in the French population, 98.5% of the population. And that was everyone from peasants all the way up to doctors and lawyers, okay? But it was really the king, the clergy, and the nobility who ran the country, even though they were a very small part of the population. And some people came to see that hierarchy as very unfair. So this is just a famous cartoon that was made before the French Revolution expressing people's frustration. So here you can see the first estate, which is a clergyman. You can tell because of his religious books and hair. You've got here a guy who is a member of the aristocracy. We can tell that from how he's dressed. Okay, he's a fancy landowner. And on what you can see here is you've got a poor, hard-working peasant who is having to carry these two guys on their back. So that is symbolic of how a lot of the French population before the French Revolution came to see the aristocracy and the clergy. Yeah, these guys who were having to be carried by the rest of the population, whose privileges were strongly resented. Okay, now you're going to have to answer a few questions at the end of the lesson using a textbook page I've put up on the privileges of each of those main groups. Okay, so I'm just going to talk you through them, but you don't need to memorize them. If you want to jot down some notes as I'm talking, you can do that. But I'm just going to quickly talk you through how this social hierarchy worked. Okay, so with these three groups, the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. So first of all, who were the first estate? Okay, so the first estate, as we already said, were the clergy. Okay, these were people who basically ran the Catholic Church in France. So France was a Catholic country before the French Revolution. It didn't have a Reformation. So they were the ones who ran the Catholic Church in France. They were a very small number of the population. So they were 0.3% of the population, about 130,000 people. But even though they were a really tiny amount of the population, they controlled nearly a tenth of the land in France. 10% of the land was controlled by them. Again, a privilege which some people came to resent. And most of that land and wealth was not held by like the ordinary priests who worked at the local level. It was owned by a small group of bishops who ran the church. Okay, so these bishops and the leaders of the church especially came to be resented by lots of the population because of the amount of land they controlled. Also, the ordinary peasants and small farmers of France had to pay the church 10% of their crop. Okay, something called a tithe. We looked at that idea when we looked at the Reformation. Okay, so the peasants would have to hand over 10% of their food, the crops they made each year, over to the church as a kind of tax for running the church. But again, a lot of the peasants came to resent that, and they resented the wealth of the church when the church was meant to be about humility and kind of like Jesus' example. So lots of the peasants especially came to really resent the privileges of the first estate, the clergy. And also, just like the aristocracy, the first estate paid no taxes. Okay, all the taxes in France were paid by the poor, not by the rich. We then have the second estate, okay, so the other group that ruled the country with the king beside the clergy, okay, and the second estate was made up of the aristocracy or the nobility, okay, so these are the big landowners who control large amounts of the land in France. They're 1.5% of the population, but they control 20% of France's land. So even though they're only 1.5% of the population, nearly a fifth of the land in the country is controlled by them. Okay, very, very unequal. And despite being the richest people in the country, they paid no taxes. Again, because France before the French Revolution was a feudal society where the aristocracy had a lot of privileges, and one of those privileges was that they didn't pay any taxes. Again, came to be strongly resented by the poor, who felt like, well, we have to pay taxes and we can't even afford to do it. They can afford to pay tax and they don't. How is that fair? So the taxation of the second estate became very controversial. As well as the privileges they had because they weren't taxed, they also had lots of feudal rights, okay, over the peasants in the surrounding lands. So in their area, they could force the peasants to pay taxes to them. They could get the peasants to work 1 or 2 days a week for free on their lands. They could force them to have to use their mills to grind down their grain to make bread. They weren't allowed to use their own mills. So all of those were examples of like the feudal rights that the aristocracy, the second estate, had over the peasants. And a lot of impoverished, remember that means poor, peasants came to demand greater freedom. So in the French Revolution, a lot of the peasantry wanted to throw off the second estate and take away the privileges they had. They wanted them to pay their share of tax, and they wanted to abolish these feudal rights that they had over the lives of the peasants in the countryside. Which takes us down to our third group, the biggest group in France, the third estate, okay, who were the other 98.5% of the population. So the vast majority of the population are members of the third estate, a bit like you guys, being the students at the bottom of the school, you're the biggest number. There were 25 million people, and that ranged with everything from the poorest peasants all the way up to highly educated and wealthy doctors, lawyers, and merchants. Remember, the third estate is anyone who doesn't have, who isn't a member, sorry, of the first and second estates. So the question is, what did all these members of the third estate have in common? If it includes everyone from the poorest peasants, the doctors and lawyers, what do they have in common? The key thing they've got in common is they have no privileges, they have no say in how the country is run, and they have little power in the old medieval power structure. So in the French Revolution, what really happens is it's about the third estate taking power, okay? They wanted to get rid of this old estate system where the king ran the country with the nobility and the clergy, and they wanted to have their rightful say in power. This is a very famous moment we'll come back to in a few lessons' time called the Tennis Court Oath. This is a moment the members of the National Assembly of France, who were members of the third estate, said, we are the rightful rulers of France, not the aristocracy and the clergy. We are the vast majority. So the French Revolution is really all about the third estate claiming their power and trying to abolish the privileges of the first and second estates to create an equality of citizenship in France. Okay then, so we've looked at this idea that France is a very unequal social hierarchy, okay? Those at the top of the social hierarchy, the king, the first and second estates, have lots of privileges compared to everyone else in the population who were known as the third estate. So it was a very unequal society, but it had been that way for a very long time. Okay, France had been a sort of feudal society for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the question is, what happened and what changed that meant that suddenly this system suddenly became untenable and people wanted to overthrow it and get rid of it? Now, there are other reasons we'll look at next lesson why the French Revolution began when it did. But a big key reason was to do with something called the Enlightenment, okay? Now, the Enlightenment, which happened just before the French Revolution, was called that because it was all about the idea of Europeans developing new ideas about how their society would be run. Remember, to become enlightened, it means to sort of become smarter, more aware of how society should be. So the Enlightenment happens, and suddenly people begin to challenge the old way of doing things. They start to think about the idea of a different kind of society. Yeah, they think that, well, okay, not only is this society unfair, but we can actually think about one which is better. So in the 18th century, people all over Europe began to think more freely and challenge old ideas about the way society should be run. So people were no longer willing after the Enlightenment, or many people were unwilling to accept this old way of organising society. They saw it was very unfair. And what you had in France was you had famous philosophers such as Voltaire and Rousseau. Voltaire, famous quote here, the comfort of the rich depends on the abundant supply of the poor. Rousseau, the famous author of the Social Contract, okay, which is a book that's all about the idea about the rulers and the ruled have to work together, and that the rulers and the ruled both have rights and privileges. The rulers can't just do whatever they want. So you had famous French philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau beginning to question why the aristocracy, the church and the monarch should have so much privilege and power. What these philosophers wanted to know was why the third estate, which was the majority of the people, should have so little power in France. So the Enlightenment was really important because it allowed people to challenge the old way society was set up and begin to think about new ways it could be organised that were fairer and more equal. Okay, so the Enlightenment was really important. You've got society is really unequal, but that on its own would not be enough because society had been unequal for a very long time in France. You need these new ideas that came with the Enlightenment in order for people to think about a better world being possible. Okay. Right, guys, so that's your short introduction to your work today on how unequal France was before the French Revolution. Now, you've got 3 other tasks to do today. Task 1 was obviously just to watch this video. The second one is there is a very short 2-minute video, which I'll put next on the playlist. Okay, there should be a link to it. But just a very good 2-minute video that talks about the impact of the Enlightenment on France. Make sure to watch that before you do the other tasks. Right, task 3 and task 4. Task 3 is your main bit of work today. Now you've got a textbook page attached in files, okay, and it might be set by an assignment as an assignment by your teachers. And this is what it will look like. Now the information you need to answer the questions is all on this left-hand side there, okay? So you have a read through this part here, but the important part you need to read to find out the information to answer the questions is on this left-hand side here. Okay, the questions are uploaded in Teams, okay, but if you want to, you can always pause the video here and answer the questions off of the textbook page here, okay? So these are the 10 questions, they'll be uploaded in Teams, but if you want to, you can just always pause the video here and answer the 10 questions that way. And make sure to the guys to do it in full sentences. Okay, and then finally, so you've watched that 2-minute video on the impact of the Enlightenment, you've answered those questions using the textbook page, and then finally, as always, you've got a very short end of lesson quiz and exit pass to complete as well. Okay, so year 8, I hope you found that interesting. Okay, there is a short challenge extension task which will be set by your teachers as well to write a speech. I won't go into that now. Have a good lesson, and I will see you next time.